So you're in a 3-bet pot and end up getting a little bit lucky to river a set. Cool. Villain checks to you. What are you betting here? What's your exact size? And what the heck should we have done throughout this entire hand? Let's talk about that today. Good morning, how are we doing today? My name is James Sweeney, aka Split Suit, and let's just jump right into this hand. So this was played at Live 2.5 over at Harrah's Cherokee, which unfortunately is very strict against log footage, so all I can do is share the exact hand with you, so hopefully this works. I know it's not as good as live log footage, but I'm doing my best here. But anyway, this is literally my first hand at the table. I have zero information on anyone. My previous game broke, so I'm moving over here with my stack size, and let's just start talking about it. So Preflop, it folds around to me, end up opening to 15, which is pretty normal sizing. The button decides to call, the small blind squeezes up to 75, and the big blind goes away. So let's just quickly talk about this preflop spot. So again, this is my first hand of the table, so I have zero information on the small blind. They look a little comfortable, but again, I've been here for all of 25 seconds. The button is a capable reg who I've played with before, but shy of that, don't really have any other information to work with. So I think it's helpful first and foremost to start with preflop ranges and kind of see what the general solver would do in this situation. So what did GTO ranges look like in this spot? So the two ranges that we're most interested in are the small blind's 3-betting range or squeezing range in this exact spot, and then also my response to that, again according to the solver. So we'll pull up the GTO ranges app from Red Chip Poker, plug in the small blind first, and we notice that they have a 7% 3-betting range according to the solver, and it is very depolarized, very linear up in that top left hand corner. And then if we look at my response here from the cutoff, we should be calling a little bit, not very often, and you notice the tens is pretty much not included there. It's very small mix as a call, but more often it is going to be suggested as a 4-bet in this spot. Pretty much all of it is supposed to get 4-bet, same thing with jacks plus, and a lot of the upper stuff too, and a little bit of sixes interestingly enough. But this is a spot where the solver definitely prefers going for the 4-bet as opposed to the call, which is actually the line that I ended up taking. And looking back at this now, I definitely think that 4-betting is going to be better than just flatting it in this exact spot. This was a little bit lazy on my behalf, but at least we're continuing. But again, 4-betting should be way better in this spot, both according to the solver and the way that I think this is actually going to work in real time at the table against real human opponents, not just robot GTO opponents. So with mistake number 1 out of the way, let's continue on with this hand. The button ends up going away. The flop is Queen 8-3 rainbow. Small blind checks, and before I talk about my action, I actually want to pull up the solver first and see what the solver would do. So this is using GTO plus, and let's fire it up. Here is my overall tree. And by the way, if you use GTO plus and you want to follow along with this solve, I'll leave a download link for the save file below so you can mess around with that and follow along with me, or just make any modifications to the tree and see what the output looks like. So again, if you're interested in that, I'll leave a link in the description box. And if you're particularly astute, you're going to notice that the calling range that I assigned for me as the in position player is different than the range suggested by the app. And the reason is because I don't think that's incredibly representative, and it's also clearly not the range that I would actually just call with in this scenario. So I decided to assign a range that I thought was a little more representative of what players, and honestly myself as well, are doing in a spot like this. Not saying it's perfect, I'm just saying that's why this range looks a little bit different than the solver range we just looked at from the app. So once the small blind checks, which the solver suggests doing 70% of the time, the combo we are most focused on, of course, is our pocket tens over here. And if you're not used to the solver, essentially what it's doing is saying all the checks are going to be in green, all of these small bets are going to be in purple or pink, and then all of the bigger bets, and bigger in this situation is half pot as opposed to quarter pot roughly, is going to be in blue. And you notice that when we hover over tens, it's suggesting that we check here 36% of the time, fire the other 64% of the time, and use the smaller 42 into a pot of 170 sizing when it does decide to fire. But even though the solver is suggesting a mix between betting and checking, I did decide to check behind in this situation because I'm not playing against a raw GTO robot. I am playing against a real human, and I thought that if I checked this behind here, I would induce more, let's just say mistake bets by my opponent on the turn, and I could always bet there if they checked the turn as well. I thought turns are going to be pretty darn face up and easy to play, and again, I think checking behind is totally fine. Solver's still on board with it a good chunk of the time as well, so check in this exact spot. Now the turn card is not one of my favorites. It's the ace of spades. My opponent checks again, and here we are. So real quick, let's just see what the solver says. So after we check and our opponent checks again on the turn, you notice that the solver is suggesting with our pocket tens a good chunk of checking and a little bit of betting, and it looks like it's using the small number a good chunk of the time, a little bit of the quote bigger number, meaning half pot as opposed to pretty much quarter pot. It's using that 2.5% of the time, but largely this is going to be a check out of the solver. But again, notice that mix between all three options as opposed to just two options in this scenario. So I'm personally good in this situation with the check behind, which is exactly what I ended up doing. River, like I alluded to earlier, is that beautiful, beautiful 10 of hearts. My opponent checks again, and now we have to decide what we're going to do. So take a moment, pause here, and think about what you would do. I'm assuming you're going to bet and not check behind. So if you are going to bet, what is the size you're going to use? Are you going to go on the smaller side of the spectrum since our opponent is looking pretty weak in this spot? Are you going to go large and hope that you punish inelasticity? Or are you going to go super large and hope that you super punish any inelasticity from any ace X or maybe pocket kings or queen X hand that might happen to be in here? So before I share my exact bet size with you, because of course I'm going to bet in this spot, let's look and see what the solver would do in this spot. So after the turn goes check check, our opponent checks the river, and here we are, and we notice that pocket tens of course is going to be a bet, and I gave the solver three different bet sizing options to work with: 130, 170, and 250. So essentially looking at a decent size bet, a pot size bet, and an over bet. And you notice that the solver does not utilize any of the larger sizing. It only utilizes checking and betting for the 130 into a 170 pot. And you notice the pocket tens is 100% a bet, and of course none of that should be incredibly surprising in this spot. But while the bet itself isn't incredibly surprising, I am a little bit shocked that the solver doesn't utilize the bigger bet sizes at all. However, we really have to keep in mind that because we're dealing with a 3-bet pot, we're not talking about incredibly wide ranges to begin with, and by the time that we look at the entire game tree after a check check and then check check and then river check, notice that we're talking about very, very few combos involved in the total range. So sometimes things can get a little bit wonky in the GTO output when you're looking at kind of these thin or less commonly taken kind of outputs or overall plays that are taken throughout the entire hand. Lines that aren't taken a tremendous amount or suggested a tremendous amount by the solver aren't going to have a tremendous amount of combos to pull from, so that can sometimes jank the way that you're looking at the output. So just keep that in mind. Now in this actual hand, I did end up betting, and I ended up choosing a size of 125. And I think this is a mistake, even though according to the solver loves it the way that this entire hand is played out. And even though the GTO solver loves this size, I personally hate it because I'm not playing against a GTO robot. I'm playing against a human. And I think when a human has ace X here, or they have a queen X hand they got a little bit tricky with on the flop, or they have pocket kings that again got a little tricky on the flop, I think they are more likely to get sticky in this situation, and as such increase that inelasticity, and as such I think I can get a bigger size through more often than not. So I just think there's more value by going something like 150 or even 175. An overbet is definitely a possibility in some opponents. Again, first hand of the table, I don't really have that information in this spot, but I'm not concerned about being behind here just simply because if my opponent had pocket aces or pocket queens, I think that gets fired somewhere along the way. If they had king jack, I think they're more likely to just fire the turn and turn it into a bluff as opposed to go for the check on the turn line. So because of that, I'm really feeling that this is largely the effective nuts, and as such needs to be fired accordingly. And again, take advantage of that inelasticity that a lot of live players tend to have. So with all of that said, again, I fire for 125. My opponent very, very quickly calls, shows me ace queen, and end up winning a nice little pot. So welcome to the table, James. Not complaining about the results, but I do think I left some money on the table here, and that's going to be a real problem in the long run. But it's really important to understand where things deviate between the raw solver output and understanding where that solver output is coming from, and then also thinking about the exact opponents you're playing against and the exploitative opportunities that may be there. And again, I think I left some money on the table here by not utilizing those exploitative opportunities, if nothing else against the overall player pool, because I don't have specific exploits against this player right this moment, but this is definitely something that I want to be looking into and making sure I'm not getting lazy with. And also make sure you take a note that the small blind did squeeze with ace queen offsuit, because not all live players will do that, so keep that in your back pocket. But anyway, thank you so much for hanging out today. I really hope you enjoyed. Please make sure to give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, learned anything from it, or just got general entertainment out of the fact that I made a couple of mistakes or little blunders in this situation. Again, thank you so much for hanging out. I'll see you back shortly with a brand new video. In the meantime, good luck out there and happy grinding.